Hi, I'm Annalisa Capurro.
And I'm Paul Ortega.
And we spoke at Modernism Week this year on Svenska 10, the home of Swedish modern.
And you're listening to us on U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guile. Every February, the modernist architectural world comes to Palm Springs, California. It's an 11-day architecture and design festival, yet they still call it Modernism Week. Again this year, U.S. Modernist Radio is there, interviewing nearly all of Modernism Week's keynote speakers plus special guests. It all happened at the U.S. Modernist Compound, a.k.a. poolside at the hip Hotel Skylark. 21st century innovations have their roots in the boom of 20th century architects who experimented with new forms and materials. And today we'll talk about two of those innovative architects, Albert Frey and Frank Lloyd Wright, with guest Leo Marmol on Albert Frey and the Aluminaire House, and Stuart Graff and Jennifer Gray from the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. Later, we'll stay on the West Coast for Bay Area jazz with the charming Elaine Lucia. Now, when you join us for Modernism Week in Palm Springs, you're signing up for a fair amount of walking. Yes, there's a complimentary Uber account you get to use, but to appreciate modernist design, you really need to get out and walk. So it helps to bring good walking shoes. And it also helps that George brings in a personal massage therapist. That's right, the U.S. Modernist Compound does free poolside massages, so afterwards you can be rejuvenated and restored, ready to walk to the next party.
It's pretty sweet.
Isn't it? And now here's your party host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
You know, one of the great things about Palm Springs and Modernism Week is just the vast buffet array of things that you have to choose from. But starting off every day, you wake up and you go outside or look through the window wherever you are. And in most places in Palm Springs, you can look up and see these majestic mountains, 10,000 feet, and there's snow still on the top usually. If it rains a lot, you'll see the green just spring up. And then at nighttime, as the sun is going down, you're seeing the sunset and the vast array of light on these mountains. It's just astonishing.
Yeah, the physical beauty of Palm Springs is something that was there even before any of those houses got built.
If you'd like to go with me and Tom to Modernism Week in February 2024 and stay with us at the U.S. Modernist Compound, email me at george@usmodernist.org. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Architects Albert Frey and Lawrence Kocher designed the Aluminaire House in 1931 for New York's Allied Arts and Industries exhibition. Tens of thousands of people went through this experimental house design. It was considered a prototype for housing in the future. Now, over 90 years later, the Aluminaire has been sitting in a tractor trailer boxed up at the Palm Springs Art Museum. Plans are to reconstruct Aluminaire on the museum grounds as a complementary structure to Albert Frey's own house, perched above the museum nearby. Frey is considered to have helped to establish desert modernism in Palm Springs, and the restoration of the Aluminaire House will be a significant exhibition for the museum. Joining George is architect and artist Leo Marmol of the legendary LA architectural firm Marmol Radziner. You can see their residential projects at usmodernist.org/MR. Leo serves on the Board of Trustees for the Palm Springs Art Museum and is coordinating the design team that has been hired by the museum to execute the project. Flexform LA featured a solo exhibition of Leo's paintings titled Fields of Desire. And in his free time, Leo enjoys saltwater fly fishing. And yes, ladies, he is single.
Don't forget the pina coladas.
Here's George's conversation with Leo Marmol, poolside at the Hotel Skylark.
Leo, it's so fun to be with you. Thanks for coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure, George. I'm thrilled to be here.
Have you done a podcast before?
I have done a podcast before.
Have they served you alcohol at the podcast before?
No, this is this is absolutely the best introduction I could have. I'm having a delicious drink here poolside.
Poolside at the Hotel Skylark, the U.S. Modernist compound. Leo, your firm, Marmol Radziner, of which you are the Marmol, has been really a known brand for such a long time. And when I first heard the phrase Marmol Radziner, I thought of it like Tesla or Genair. I mean, I didn't really know there was a Marmol and a Radziner, but I just knew whatever it was really good. I mean, this has been fantastic. You've been doing this, 30-some years?
We started working together, Ron and I, in 1989. So it's been many years, and I certainly thank you for that celebration.
And in that time, you have taken on all kinds of projects.
It's true.
A lot of extraordinary residences, including one here in the area you did for yourself.
I did. We did our prototype prefab home here just outside of Desert Hot Springs. And that was a fun experimentation with prefabrication.
And what was prefabrication like when you did it? Was it this mythical thing where trucks show up and 3 days later you have a home? Or what was the state of the art at that point?
It's interesting because the ideas of prefabrication have been with us since modernism began. There's always been an interest in the social issues around housing and commercial buildings, and modernism saw both aesthetic ideals mixed with social dreams of a more equitable availability of high design.
I know people have been chasing this dream a long time. Frank Lloyd Wright was chasing it back in the 40s and 50s.
Name any modernist, and they chased it. So
Yeah.
we, in that tradition, chased it as well. And there were, for us, many important lessons around that idea of whether or not it's possible to produce higher quality homes through industrialized processes.
I mean, the trick seems to be, in getting the site ready, right? I mean, that's what takes the longest time, because some of these prefab projects are a day, a week, a month, and some of them are much longer, but the time to get the approvals and the utilities and everything else to a site can take quite a while.
Well, that's one of the challenges, and the part that's often not discussed is that there are, you're correct, two parts. There's the factory side or the industrialized side of producing either a kit or a panel or a module. And then there's the site side, which is, in a sense, a conventional construction and permitting process, only you now add this complexity of bringing those two together into one structure.
How was it? I mean, you were the client here as well as the architect, right? So how was it to go through this? What'd you learn?
We learned so much. Yes, my home was the first prototype, so it was the first time we really tried this, and we learned a lot. At the time, we were using an outside factory. We learned that was a challenge, so we established our own factory.
You did? Okay.
And that was going beautifully, and things were starting to really work and ramp up and become profitable. And then 2008 came, and
That's a recession for those of you that are really young.
Yes, for those that don't know, in 2008, overnight, the entire housing market literally disappeared. Funding disappeared, and the entire construction design market contracted, along with the kind of economic collapse fueled by the precarious marketplace that the country had put itself into.
That's a very elegant way of stating it.
Yes. The disastrous, irresponsible economic kind of cliff that bankers and stockbrokers put us in.
Mortgage brokers. A lot of mortgage companies
Yes.
were behind that too, right?
Yes.
At this point, did you have to stop your plant? basically?
Yes.
Okay.
At that point, just to protect the
Yeah.
history of Marmol Radziner, we decided to close the factory. And so at that point, we would have had to shift to outside manufacturing again. So we decided instead we would stop producing prefab homes.
Go back to what you had been doing before,
Our
basically.
core business has always been the alteration of historic modern structures, mainly homes, as well as new homes and commercial and retail structures. It's a pretty wide range of work that we do.
So you and Ron are the Batman and Robin, I'm not sure who is who, of these restorations. I mean, you're the one that people pick up the phone and call when they have a serious modernist house and they want to fix it up.
I'm not going to address the Batman and Robin analogy, but I will say it's been an honor to work with some of the most incredible historic homes out there. And for us, it's continuing education in modern thinking and to learn directly from the modern masters by restoring their work and having to figure out how to rebuild them, reconstruct them, remake them, keep them from leaking, heat them, cool them, all the things we need to make those structures do. It's really a marvelous way of learning.
Tell us about your firm's work with the famous Kaufman House by Richard Neutra here in Palm Springs, one of the iconic properties here in town.
It's so funny because when we talk about the Kaufman House, we speak of it with such contemporary excitement. We actually started that project in 1993 and completed the work in 1998. So for us, this was a long time ago. But then, and certainly even today, that was one of the most academically rigorous restoration processes that we have ever been through. The clients, Brent and Beth Harris, were fully committed to learning, understanding, and figuring out the right way to do modern preservation. And again, because it was so long ago, not many modern houses had been preserved prior to this.
They were one of the sort of first ones to go big, weren't they?
We were out there on the edge. We were trying to figure out how to apply preservation ideals and practices that had been employed for other historical styles, but never to the discipline of a modern structure. And so to do that, really in many ways for all of us, for the first time on such an important, iconic structure was horrifying.
Brent, when he was on our show, told us a story about some of the stones for the walls around the property that either you or he had researched where this rock had come from, and it was some quarry, and he contacted the quarry, and the mine or whatever it is had been closed for years, and he made some kind of arrangement to go dig in that again, and they sent him a whole boatload of the stone. It turned out to be wrong, and they had to go back and dig it again.
Okay, I'll tell you the whole story.
Okay, here we go.
So we had many stone walls that had been removed for additions to the structure. The house had literally doubled in size, and so we had to find a way to rebuild portions of the walls that had been lost, completely removed.
Yeah.
And so, of course, we had some historic stone. So we cut up a piece of stone and sent it to quarries along with photographs all over the country. We knew it was a U.S. quarry. And we got back samples from multiple quarries that said, hey, maybe this could be it. This kind of looks like your stone. We went then to UCLA, and they do a process called petrographic analysis, where they cut a microscopic thin layer of the original stone, and then they cut similar layers from all the samples that we had from different quarries until they found an exact match.
It's like stone CSI.
Yes. We, in so many ways, restoration is exactly that. You're sleuths, you're detectives, you're trying to figure out, hey, where did this come from? How the hell did they make this thing way back when. And so we had identified which quarry it came from. And we knew for a fact.
Where was it, by the way? Do you remember?
In Utah.
Okay.
And so we had this quarry. And, quarry, it sounds so romantic, doesn't it?
It does.
It's basically...
Picnic by the quarry.
Yes. It's basically a big hole in the ground where they're digging rocks out. And so the rocks that they're currently removing from the quarry were different. They were a different color, a different tone. So we went to the quarry, literally, and with maps that they had of the quarry, found the general area where they were quarrying in the 1940s at that time.
This is a movie right here, I tell you.
Oh, man. So here we are literally digging through the quarry. And by then, that part of the quarry is totally overgrown. And there's trees and mature trees. And we find these veins of color that match our walls. And so we say, okay, we found it. The mother lode, right? Dig
Indiana Jones and the Temple of Stone.
Yes. And so how hard could that be? So we placed our order and off we went back to California, and they quarried our stone. We got our shipment, and lo and behold, the stone didn't match. See, the quarry didn't really believe us, these wackos from California, right?
Yeah.
They just quarried from where they're quarrying and shipped us the stone, figuring we wouldn't care.
Oh, they didn't
or
actually
notice.
go into the overgrown part?
Of course not. That's hard.
Oh, okay.
So instead, they just quarried from
Their
where
normal
they're
stuff.
digging. And so we had to go back and say, no, we're serious. We're not kidding. We want the stone from this spot. And at that point, they did it. They quarried from that spot. We got the stone we needed. So it really was a perfect match. And to this day, it's really amazing. You cannot tell what's a new wall and what's an original historic wall.
You also put a new structure on the property.
We did. And I will say, when you are placing a new structure so close to an iconic historic structure that has changed the world, there's a lot of trepidation. How do you think about a new structure? Number one, it can't look like the Kaufman House. It has to be distinct so that there's no lack of clarity that this is an addition. And, of course, you don't want to try to compete or upstage the original house. So it's a very simple, modern box. And in that box, we put all the elements that we didn't want to put into the historic house. The important things like
a bar.
Like a bar and a big screen TV and a humidor and a gym and a sauna, all those necessities of life that you want to integrate, but you really would struggle to put it in a home that was designed in the 40s.
Now, I have to ask, have you gone to see Don't Worry, Darling yet?
I have not seen the movie, but everyone tells me I need to, and I will do that.
Don't Worry, Darling features the Kaufman House prominently as the home of the evil villain, I think, in this, played by Chris Pine.
Well, it's so interesting when you look at the history of film and villainhood. The villains always have the coolest homes. Look at Diamonds Are Forever with the Elrod house. It's always the bad guy that has the cool, sexy, modern house. And why is that? Because there has to be something attractive about the bad guy. If they're truly despicable and horrible and you have no sympathy or connection, well, you just want him killed off in the first scene.
Right.
But the modern house gives the villain a sense of kind of appeal and sensuality and dignity and intelligence. So you want to romanticize not just the good person, but also the bad person. So then the conflict is truly memorable.
Right, because you'd think if this evil villain is going to be taking over the world with his grand scheme, he should have good taste, too.
You kind of want to root for the evil person when you realize, oh, my God, they're living in the Kaufman House or Elrod. Maybe it's okay that they rule the world.
In the movie, which is really fun, It's kind of a takeoff on the Stepford Wives, which was made in the late 60s, early 70s, and then again, I think about 10 years ago. This is a plot where this idyllic community is taking place in what looks like Palm Springs. They call it Victory is what they call it, I believe. And the plot kind of unravels towards the end as one of the women in this whole thing figures out that everything is not as it seems. But that doesn't stop you from taking in not only the Kaufman House, but a whole gorgeous cul-de-sac of houses here in town, which is on Azul Circle. I'll tell our audience, because if you drive over to Azul Circle, there'll be 3 other cars in the cul-de-sac taking photos. It's become a real icon around town now.
Okay, George, I promise I'm going to go see the movie.
Yeah. Tell me about some of the other great houses that you have restored, because there are a lot.
Oh, wow. Really, it's such an honor to be able to think about the fact that we've restored John Lautner's Garcia House, which is
for sale now, I believe.
It is for sale, so you can all go out and buy it. I think it's listed for $16 million. So, George, maybe you and I can just pool our funds together. And
I have 10 I can put down. 10,000, that is.
All right. Well, we may need some more of you out in the audience. So, the Garcia House was a stunning, beautiful, kind of organic piece of architecture by John Lautner, and just had gone into a bit of disrepair, and it was time to bring it up to current standards. And so much of what we're doing is figuring out a way to keep water out of the structure and how to rebuild things that had been lost or termite ridden or dry rotted. And so a lot of it's repair, and then reimagining certain elements like the kitchen and how to make that work with contemporary appliances and contemporary attitudes toward cooking. And so you're in many ways changing structures, but doing it in a way that is respectful and sympathetic to the original ideal.
For a number of years, when I would talk to people about Lautner's Garcia House, they would say, "Oh, didn't they tear it down?" And they were thinking of the Lethal Weapon movie where Mel Gibson, I think, ties his truck or something to the house and causes it to collapse.
I guess this whole podcast is going to be about film and architecture. And yes, it's true.
Yeah.
That home was pulled down the hill because, once again, the evil villains were living there, and it had to be destroyed. And so, yes, it's true. But fortunately, that was a model.
Yes, and not the real thing.
Not the real thing.
Not the real thing.
But we've done others. We did the Cronish House, which is Richard Neutra in the mid-50s, and that was in Beverly Hills, and that was an amazing opportunity to bring back.
That was one that was near death, wasn't it, before it was sold?
It had been fully condemned to death, and so fortunately a savior stepped in with the intent to preserve and really protect the legacy. It was bought with the same perspective that you would buy a historic painting that had been damaged, and wanting to bring it back to life. And I think that's true of all owners of historic properties. They are the true heroes in this story. It's never the architect. We are there to serve our clients. It's the homeowners that take it upon themselves to commit their resources and really adopt their life to become a part of this structure. And it's so fascinating. You talk to them after people have been living in these modern historic homes for a number of years, and they will tell you they certainly invested to transform the home and save it, but then the home gives back and transforms their lives and changes the way they think about the world, and they see things like quality and beauty and detail. It's a collaboration between lifestyle and physical properties of homes.
And although we all know this at some existential level, modernist homeowners really know that they don't own the house. The house kind of owns them for a short period of time, whether that's 5 years or 30 years.
Yeah, it's a dialogue, and I think that we are all owned on some level by forces outside ourselves, whether that's our homes, our spouses, our technology, our cars, whatever it is. We choose the things that influence us. And I think to choose a modern home to influence you is a celebration of nature. It's a desire to live more in connection with each other and the natural environment. I think we're all making choices every day of things we want to influence us. And I certainly would want to choose in my architecture a modern relationship.
Now, you are working on another restoration, which has been a long, long time coming. And that's the Aluminaire House in Palm Springs. Designed by Albert Frey in the 30s, it was an exhibition house for what the home of the future could be like. And when it went on display, I don't know the exact number, but a lot of people toured it. This was just the most incredible thing they'd ever seen. It didn't look like any house they'd ever seen before. The features on the inside were state-of-the-art for that time. Tell us about the Aluminaire House, Leo.
Well, in 1931, when the exhibition opened, in 8 days, over 100,000 people walked through the house, which is pretty incredible. Now, first of all, let me explain my role. I am on the board of trustees at the Palm Springs Art Museum. And as a board member, I am directing the design team that is truly responsible for making this possible for the museum. And so we are right now in the process of completing a set of construction documents through this design team. And so we are helping to coordinate this group of professionals. And with that set of construction documents, we will go out to bid with a general contractor that's been pre-selected to price the project. And that will allow us as a museum to know what our full cost is. At that point, I, as a board member, can go back to the board and get authorization to fundraise for this project. So we're not yet officially moving forward other than pricing the project, developing the budget, so I can ask the board to allow us to raise the money. My hope is at the end of April of this year, when the board authorizes us to raise money, we can then come back to all of you, and George, I'll get your $10,000 that you were going to commit to the Garcia House, and instead we will put it into the Aluminaire House.
Our listeners may be wondering, like, well, why do you need to go through all this trouble to restore a house? Well, one reason is that the house is now in a tractor trailer. It's really had an interesting journey from where it was in New York. It was taken from its original site and I believe moved to one of the Rockefeller properties. Is that right?
Well, it's had a number of homes. And first of all, we have to recognize that this is actually one of the most significant individual structures in the U.S. today. Significant for a number of reasons. One is that it was designed by A. Lawrence Kocher, who was an architect, but more importantly, the editor of Architectural Record for a decade, in conjunction with Albert Frey. Albert Frey was Swiss, went to France to study under Le Corbusier, and at the time when Albert Frey was working with Le Corbusier, it was one of 2 staff members. So certainly Albert Frey had very direct learning from the master.
Yes.
And then Albert Frey took that knowledge, came to the United States, and worked with A. Lawrence Kocher to design an exhibition house. The house was designed, therefore, by significant modern architects, but it was the first example of this revolutionary new international style in the United States. He took the learning, direct learning from Le Corbusier, and applied it to the first structure as an exhibition in New York City. So thousands of people saw the structure through this exhibition. It was also the first example of a structure that used these new technologies and new materials of, one, prefabrication, two, aluminum. Aluminum was a new modern material, revolutionary at the time, lighter, structurally competent. So the Aluminaire House has significance on so many levels. This is important. It was important to us as architects. It's important to the history of modernism. And the fact that it is now held as an art object by the Palm Springs Art Museum is really an incredible opportunity for the museum to celebrate and honor Albert Frey, our native son from right here in Palm Springs, an important modern structure, and literally right up the hill from it was Frey's own personal home. And so you will have Frey's first house that was international styled. It was an exhibition house. It was made and fabricated with new technologies and materials, and his own home until the end of his life, just virtually a walking distance from the exhibition.
It's really pretty incredible. And the house had several locations. It was taken apart and put back together. On this last road trip, it was taken apart in New York and trucked across the country, where it's been sitting here in the tractor trailer for a number of years. And now that tractor trailer has been moved to the grounds of the Art Museum, where you can see it if you drive by. So in theory, right, I know this is in theory, it should be pretty straightforward to like open the truck and put it back together, but it's not going to be that simple, is it?
Oh, it's like anything, right? How hard could it be to just put up a little exhibition that happens to be 3 stories tall? It's a real building being put up by an institution that has to worry about liability, and then we have to get a building permit, and now we have building codes, and the structure, of course, doesn't meet current building codes or energy standards or earthquake requirements. So how hard could it be to throw that thing up in the California desert?
Well, one of the things that has plagued exhibition houses going back for almost 100 years is you've got to get past the city planning and approval process, which sometimes doesn't make the distinction between a work of art that you're showing just as a demonstration and a real residence that someone is going to live in. So how do you get the city to be a little more lenient as far as seeing that this is an artifact as opposed to a residence where you're going to spend your vacation?
You know, it's interesting. We work with cities literally all over the country with historic properties. And if you are sincere and honest and collaborative with cities, we found that the response is one of support. Cities, they get a bad rap, but the reality is we count on them to protect our safety and our livelihoods and the value of our properties. And they carry this burden of support and protection. And so to say that the cities are kind of unsupportive, I don't think is fair. I think I will say Palm Springs, and we've been working with them for literally decades with historic properties. We have always found them to be truly trying to help us work through the codes. We as architects still have to protect the safety and welfare of the public, and that can never be diminished. So we have to find ways to compromise and adapt and adopt and tinker with these codes in a way that maintains safety. And so with the city of Palm Springs, the first thing we had to say is, it's not a house. It was never a house. This was always an exhibition. Yes, in some of its later uses, it became a house, but it was designed by Kocher and Frey as an example, as an exhibition. So the Palm Springs Art Museum, our intent is to put the exhibition back in play. Mm-hmm. And so it's not a house. And that relieves a great deal of burden of, access requirements and Title 24 heating and energy codes. And so we're working with the city to find a safe way to get it back up again. And yes, we're re-engineering it so that it will withstand an earthquake and perform so that we minimize risk of injury should that occur. So the city's an ally. They're a partner in this enterprise, and we have to satisfy those requirements.
When people come to visit Palm Springs, Frey is certainly a name that they come to hear about. I understand that Frey and Kocher did a little office building downtown that is still kind of hidden away because it's not ever on tour.
Yeah, that's what brought Albert Frey to Palm Springs, is to come out and do the Kocher Sampson building. Once Frey was here, again in collaboration with A. Lawrence Kocher, he fell in love with the desert. And wow, I did the same. The California desert, Palm Springs, is to me the most powerful landscapes I've ever experienced. We're sitting here, I know none of you can see this, but George and I are sitting here sipping delicious drinks by the pool, looking up at the San Jacinto Peak. And it's been raining here, so there's a green tint to the mountain, and beyond there is snow. So we have this snow-capped pile of rock that is so powerful with these orange and pink hues. And it's this presence in the valley here that is eternal, is this powerful mountain that overlooks this city. And Albert Frey fell in love with that landscape and the color, and his final house, his resting place, is literally built into that mountain.
In January of 2024, the Palm Springs Art Museum in their Architecture and Design building downtown on Palm Canyon Drive will be hosting a new exhibition on Albert Frey, curated by Brad Dunning. That's going to be an amazing exhibition that will run for about 6 months over the first half of 2024, and we'll be talking about that again next year.
I am so excited. I mean, first of all, Brad Dunning's done a number of exhibitions. He did a show recently on the history of the chair that just was so lyrical and powerful. Brad Dunning, he's one of those people that makes magic out of everything he touches. And Brad has helped to shape the modern community here in the desert and beyond. He is lyrical and elegant and dashing and subtle and understated and modest. I don't know, there's something about the desert that turns these powerful individuals like Brad Dunning and Albert Frey and Stu Williams and softens their edges. It makes masters speak so humbly and quietly and softly. And maybe, again, that's just the impact of this mountain that surrounds us and makes us all feel very humble and human. And often it's the thing that's missing in architecture, is this conversation around our humanity and dignity.
Leo, thank you so much for talking with me. I'll make sure that we talk again next year when we can get an update on Aluminaire and how it's doing.
Well, with any luck, we will be talking about how wonderful the opening was and how exciting it is to see that exhibition in the landscape. But George, really, I am thrilled to be here. It's been fun, and I look forward to more conversations.
Since we recorded that interview with Leo Marmol in February, the Palm Springs Art Museum has approved the plan, and they are now in full fundraising mode. You can support this effort at psmuseum.org.
Frank Lloyd Wright founded the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation in the mid-20th century. Wright Foundation president and CEO Stuart Graff now protects Wright's legacy into the 21st century. A Wright fan, Graff grew up in the town where Wright got his start, Chicago. After a career as a corporate attorney, he lives in Arizona, and his office is at Wright's Taliesin. Graff was named one of the 30 most influential Phoenicians.
Walk like a Phoenician.
With him is Jennifer Gray, director of the new Taliesin Institute, established by the Wright Foundation. Jennifer earned her PhD in architectural history from Columbia University.
Go Lions!
Before working at the Venerable Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA, in New York, where she curated the Frank Lloyd Wright at 150 Unpacking the Archive. Here's their conversation with us in Palm Springs.
Stuart, how is it to manage the architectural Elvis and Graceland?
Well, it's a full-time adventure, and sometimes it's a thrill ride. Managing the two Taliesin properties and the larger legacy of Frank Lloyd Wright really is a bit of an adventure. We have not only an incredible amount of work to do because all of Wright's buildings were experimental, but these are among the most experimental buildings because the two Taliesins were Wright's laboratories for the creation of his organic architecture. And so there's a lot of, shall we say, unusual building technique and even hiring staff. You bring in great carpenters and you tell them they have to rebuild something. And they want to change the structure because they say, well, that's not the way it should have been done. And we have to tell them, no, you have to do it the wrong way because that's the way Frank Lloyd Wright did it. And they're confused, but that's part of what preservation is keeping the past there so it can be studied, so that we can learn from it, so that we can grow from it. And if we don't keep it the way it was, even though today we might use different materials, different techniques, then we're not doing our job. And then we also have another aspect, which is the larger legacy. And Jennifer's actually involved really at the core of that larger legacy, which is how to keep these ideas that Wright was developing, how to keep them alive and relevant, not just today, but for future generations. So we try to present the history that Frank Lloyd Wright was a part of, not in a backwards-looking way, but in a forwards-looking way. Because Wright spends his whole career facing forward, not just embracing the future, but helping to create the future. And if we're not presenting his legacy in a way that explains and elicits how it's going to be relevant to the future, then we're not doing our jobs.
But this really is an industry, too, like Elvis. I mean, the Frank Lloyd Wright empire of property and academic programs and coffee mugs, right?
Yep.
Is big.
It is big. So let's start with some data.
Yeah.
We just did some market research. About 72% of Americans know Frank Lloyd Wright. That's on par with Ralph Lauren and Martha Stewart, to set a context of household names.
And the second most recognized name in architecture must be way behind
the
it.
second most recognized is about 19%.
Okay.
And that's Frank Gehry and Zaha Hadid are tied. But of that 72%, 87% of the 72%, so more than half, that's the only architect people
that they know. Yeah, right.
They don't know any other architect.
Right.
And that's pretty striking because you think about how architecture is all around us. And yet we take it for granted. We don't really understand where it's coming from, who's doing it. And I think that's probably true of a lot of things in our society. So we start off with that brand recognition. And then we start off with the whole set of, like Elvis, dramas that have been created. There's a lot of mythology. There's a lot of fiction. And Frank Lloyd Wright created some of that. The foundation, the members of the fellowship created it. And then there are plenty of works, literally works of fiction, books, plays, and opera that have been written about Wright that, like all works of fiction,
maybe opera?
Opera. There's an opera called Shining Brow. We just actually did it at the Arizona Opera a couple of years ago, and the foundation worked with the opera to present it, context for it.
Okay.
But there's an opera because, look, there's his relationships, his several marriages, and some extramarital relationships, one in particular. There are murders, there are fires, there's tragedy, there's travel.
Leaving the country,
being charged with what would have been called at the time white slavery with the Mann Act. I mean, there's a lot of interesting biography there. But the biography often is presented as, look at quirky Frank Lloyd Wright. And what you really need to understand if you look at the biography is the integration of this man's mind. He was setting out not only to change architecture, not only to create a set of building principles that came out of what was happening in America at the time, principles about democracy and liberty, but he was also trying to do that in the rest of his life. He believed that America presented this new opportunity for freedom, unshackled from the mores and tenets of social organization of the old world. And so that makes for a complex and rich life that is fertile ground for drama. But when you look at it through the integration of his mind, that this man is nothing less than a revolutionary who fundamentally believes in the promise that America represents, he becomes a lot less of a caricature as he's often presented and a whole lot more interesting. And I think that's what we really try to do at the foundation, is to set that context for just what a fascinating mind this man had and how synthetic, looking at architecture, economics, social development, globalism, so many things that the forces that were at work in shaping America in the first part of the 20th century. And that's really fascinating. And we have that opportunity to get past the mythology. The mythology is a great way in. It's a door opener. But now let's look at the reality and show that that reality is so much more interesting than all the stories that have been told.
I wasn't aware until recently that the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation wasn't something that happened post-1959 after he died. It actually occurred during Wright's lifetime.
So Wright actually creates the foundation in 1940. It's a combination of probably a couple of different forces. First, he started this apprentice program. He very clearly says it's not a school, says that many times, but it's in the nature of a training program, so it's become known as a school. And he saw that as a nonprofit enterprise. And it's the middle of the Depression, and he doesn't have a lot of work coming in, so he wants to make sure that, in addition to paying for people's meals and materials to build the dormitories that they would live in and things like that, that he's also, not having to be burdened with taxes at the time for what's fundamentally an educational program, an apprenticeship program. But he says very explicitly, and it is in his last will and testament, that the purpose of the foundation is to perpetuate the teaching of organic architecture. And he wants us to do this by the training of architects and designers. So the apprenticeship program was intended to continue after his death. And it did continue after his death. He begins licensing his work in 1955 so that others, besides his clients and those who are training directly under him, can start to use these principles of organic architecture for their design, and so that this can go out into the future. Today, we have the Taliesin Institute, which is what Jen runs, that's carrying that forward. Maybe Jen, do you want to talk a little bit about what the Institute is and what it does?
Sure. So the Taliesin Institute engages academic and professional audiences in Wright's principles of organic architecture. But I would say that part of my role, not to mar the brand identity, but is to dig beneath that and kind of unpack Frank Lloyd Wright in a more critical way. And so, it's easy to get seduced by the mythologies, as Stuart said before. He's a household name. People know the prairie houses. So it's easy to kind of skip along the surface with Wright and think that he's just these things that are more well known. But if you dig deeper, he's a social activist. He's doing affordable housing. He's looking at nature for inspiration. Today we would call that sustainable design or biophilic design. He's doing all these things well in advance of their time. And so my role, engaging academic audiences, is to kind of start parsing those more critical angles and just to kind of look at him as a very talented architect. He's a deep thinker. He has a lot of social and political ideas that go with his architecture. It's not just design. It's not just style. And kind of look at him from all these multifaceted ways as a way to kind of unpack him. He's not a mythic figure. He's not on a pedestal. He's a human who's also a genius in terms of architecture, but he's flawed at the same time. And so part of the role of the Taliesin Institute is to start taking some of those deeper steps and move away a little bit from some of the drama.
And one thing that's really important that Jen has just alluded to, critically important, is that we view ourselves as much as an architecture organization as a history organization. And as a history organization, our job is to be factual. So Frank Lloyd Wright was flawed. We're not here to worship a hero. We're here to present the legacy, warts and all, imperfections and all. And, the interesting thing is he did that too. There was this public persona of this great authority figure. I guess that's what you had to do back in the day when you were being interviewed by Mike Wallace instead of being interviewed on podcasts.
Right.
But
I could start smoking if you'd like, because that's what Mike Wallace does in the on the TV show. Yeah.
But what I think is great about it is that Wright laughs at himself. Even if you watch that interview, look at his eyes and look at his mouth. He comes off with one of those zingers that he likes to come up with, these great quotable quotes. And then you see him glance briefly at the camera and you see the corners of his mouth curl up in just the smallest smile because he's like, yep, I'm doing my Frank Lloyd Wright thing for you. And in private, he was, according to people who still live at the two Taliesins and who worked with him, I mean, so we've had people there since the 1940s who are still with us. And they'll tell you this was an incredibly human, funny, generous, genial man. Yes, he had his moods, don't we all? But he acknowledged his mistakes. He, looked at things that he wanted to learn from, as we all do. And I think that's important that we recognize that this is a human being who had a great mind and a great talent, but supremely approachable and really concerned. And Moshe Safdie says this in his recent memoir, no architect more concerned with the well-being of his clients than Frank Lloyd Wright. And I don't think that's the general perception, but in fact, that's what it's all about. Every building, every structure starts with the lives of the people who would inhabit it. And that's so important that he puts it on the wall of the theater at Taliesin West.
Yeah, I mean, his ego is legendary and perhaps mythic, but his concern for his clients is also mythic, or should be.
And I would also say that his concern just for society writ large, I mean, his clients included, but he's very concerned about social inequality, for example. He's very concerned about, the environment and things like that. So it's not just his clients. I think he's concerned in a much broader way about the direction society is going into. So I think he's both. He has a big ego and he wants to solve these very pressing social problems. He's not one or the other. And I think that's where the drama and the mythology gets in the way, because most things are both. They're not one or the other.
Yeah, if you think you're going to solve these great problems, you're going to have a big ego. It takes a big ego to take on those problems.
So I have a question about the various entities involved here. So there's the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, and there's a fellowship, which was mostly independent for a long time.
So the fellowship was the name. He says it's not a community, but I don't have a better word for it. The community of people who were part of the foundation. So the fellowship sort of morphs into the foundation. And after Wright dies, the fellowship is the group that's actually controlling the legal entity of the foundation.
Okay.
But the fellowship are the group of apprentices that came. They stayed on average about 14 months from what our research tells us. So people think it's people that stayed for decades. Nope. You had people like John Lautner or Alden Dow who stayed for a couple of months. You had some people who left after 2 weeks because it wasn't what they were expecting. And you have someone like Minerva Montooth, whose 99th birthday was this week, who arrives, I think, in 1947. And she's still living at Taliesin.
Okay.
Wow.
So how does the school evolve out of that? How does this apprenticeship/school program?
So by the 1980s, architectural education had changed from primarily an apprentice-driven professional program to a licensure program. That's just changes in state law and regulation and industry self-regulation. And as a result, this apprenticeship program had really started to struggle to attract people to come and work in it, because what they were doing was apprenticing with the architectural practice called Taliesin Architects, and then it changed its name to Taliesin Associated Architects, which is the firm after Frank Lloyd Wright dies. So now they need to do something else if they're going to continue this program. So in the mid-1980s, Mrs. Wright, the third Mrs. Wright,
Olga
Vana consents to the formation of a school, even though Wright had not been a fan of the school. She says, nope, I think this is the way forward. And a gentleman named Tom Casey, someone who'd been an apprentice there for many years, Tom really leads the effort, along with the other members of the fellowship, to have the school accredited. And that continues on, still operating actually very much like an apprenticeship program, until the Taliesin Associated Architects firm goes out of business in 2003. And it was struggling for clients. It was struggling in a lot of different ways. And it was just sort of hit the end of its life cycle. Businesses end at some point in time, and this one ended in 2003. And then it became more like a traditional school, using outside projects. In architectural education, you might call these sponsored studios, where a builder, a designer says, hey, I want students to work on this project for me. I want to see what they can do. I need some interns, but they're not interns, they're sponsored studios to work on these projects with us. And that continues along, and it goes through a series of leadership changes, as does the foundation, because the apprentices who were the fellowship begin to die off. Some of them just launch off away and start their own practices because they don't like the school. The formation of the school instead of an apprenticeship was controversial even among the members of the fellowship. And so these lines that had more or less unified everybody before the foundation of the school and before the end of Taliesin Associated Architects, that unity begins to crack and crumble. You then add on pressures from an accrediting organization that I think it was 2012 or 2014, said schools need to be self-supporting. They cannot be supported by another entity. So Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, you and the school have to separate. And that's what happens. By 2017, we had convinced the Higher Learning Commission, our accreditor, that the school can sustain itself, and it separates out from the foundation and becomes a wholly independent institution.
Is it still an alliance with the foundation, or is it completely independent now?
It's completely independent, and they actually moved off from our campuses in 2020. They're now based at Arco Santi. When we separated out, and the pandemic actually gave us some time to explore different ways to approach professional education and higher education, we began this exploration that went back to looking at what made the fellowship work. And from that exploration, we talked to architects, we talked to architectural educators around the world, we talked to members of the fellowship, we looked at historical documents. And from a year or so of really intense exploration of different business models, we decided that Frank Lloyd Wright knew what he was doing in creating something like the fellowship, that you don't need to be at Taliesin for 3 years in a classroom-like environment to learn from the two campuses. In fact, you might be better to learn from, let's just say, more casual interactions with the campus. And so we formed the Taliesin Institute. We announced that at the end of 2021, beginning of 2022. This is the group at Arco Santi? No, this is the group that Jennifer now leads.
Okay.
And we're bringing in students. Well, you should talk about who we're bringing in, Jen.
Yeah, sure. So we went back and looked at Wright's original kind of ethos behind the Taliesin Fellowship, and he's very clear it's not a school. It's a very broad curriculum. It's not just architecture. People come and go. You know, it's something quite different. It's more of a community, as Stuart said before. And so we wanted to kind of not recreate it, but sort of distill the essence of what it had been and try and bring that up to date for our contemporary moment. So the Institute, it's not degree granting, it's not accredited, but we partner with external universities to bring students through anywhere from a few days at a time to maybe a month. Some of them are architecture students, and so they might actually do work on site. Some are preservation studios, so they might do preservation work that then we use to help support the campuses. Some are historians, like myself, come in to learn about Wright's organic principles of architecture and how they apply more broadly to modern architecture. So, and it kind of just runs the gamut, and each one's a bit customized. And so we've been able to bring in thus far this year about 200 students through Taliesin West and Taliesin. So it's the idea is to really broaden the reach to more students to give them access to the learning opportunities at the campuses.
Sure.
And that's in contrast to the school, which had 14 students, I think, when they left in 2020.
So
we're able
expansion.
to have a much bigger impact with Wright's legacy.
Right. So what is the school at Arco Santi called now?
The School of Architecture.
That's it?
That's it. That's their name.
There's no Frank Lloyd Wright? There's no Taliesin?
The School of Architecture.
Okay. And so now you've tried to go and recreate some of the original intent of the program through what you're doing now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I would say distill it versus recreate it. Sort of what were their, the essence of what they were doing versus just copying and mimicking, but to get back.
There's learning by doing. That's a core part of Wright's pedagogy. It's about engaging with the natural landscapes, not just looking at buildings or reading about things in books, and not just about drawing, but really understanding how does nature work and how do those natural processes, because nature, in a sense, is the best architect in its integration of form and function, while also creating beauty in the process. And how do we get these students to understand that process? Well, the campuses, and this is not our point of view, this is what we were told during this investigatory process when the school separated out in 2020. The campuses are the best teaching tools in and of themselves. Once you immerse yourself in the campus, and it doesn't take long for you to get past what I call the Frank Lloyd Wright factor, where all the preconceived ideas you have about Wright start to fade away, and the buildings and the landscapes and the integrations just start speaking to you, you very quickly begin to understand what Wright was doing. And there's almost no lesson about architecture that you can't learn from those buildings.
Okay. And so is there still a fellowship that operates at either Taliesin?
There's no fellowship.
Okay.
So the fellowship really sort of ends. There's a few members still alive, but the fellowship really ended back in the mid-2000s.
Okay.
It formally, I guess, stopped admitting people in 2008, but it really hadn't admitted people for 20 years before that. We're a nonprofit organization. We have an independent board that oversees us. We have a professional staff of educators, preservation architects, preservation specialists, museum leaders, finance leaders, like any other educational and cultural institution that you might find.
And how does the public engage with these locations, Taliesin East and West?
So probably the biggest volume of engagements comes from our public access or tour programs. Come to the two Taliesins, take a tour. We have different ways to engage in that tour program, both guided tours and self-guided explorations, where we have an audio guide, including narration by Frank Lloyd Wright himself, because we have hundreds of hours of talks and lectures that he gave, interviews that he gave, talking about these places. Any interaction with any cultural institution is not just what the institution presents, but it's what you bring to it. Right. And so if you're sitting there listening to what someone's telling you and your mother raised you right, you're going to focus on that person and maybe put your own ideas and your own experiences aside to listen to what that person's saying. Those self-guided explorations really allow you to immerse yourself and really bring out what you're feeling, what you're experiencing, and what you bring to the party when you come to the campuses. We also have performing arts programs, lectures, wellness programs, because as Jen said, there were a lot of things going on. There were movements that were part of what the fellowship did, movements from a European named Gurdjieff, who was very influential in Mrs. Wright's life. And
George Gurdjieff, yeah.
Yep. And so this idea of wellness and movement and experiencing your body in this space, that was a part of what the fellowship engaged in. So we keep doing that. And when I joined the foundation 7 years ago, I spent the first 90 days diving deep into strategy. That's what most of my background is in strategy. And I discovered very quickly that Frank Lloyd Wright knew exactly what he was doing, because he understood how to use these places to get people to think about their interactions and connections with the world so that they could develop this sort of unified approach to living between building, nature, their activity. Wright says that architecture starts from the within and grows outward, meaning that it starts with the person and their experience and grows outward. And the set of programs that Wright had for the fellowship and that we try to engage in today for the public to interact with us, that was really the smartest thing that we could do, follow Wright's lead.
So people can visit both campuses. One question I had was that after Wright died in 1959, there were a number of projects that were finished, where Wright obviously didn't get to direct to supervise. And then there were periods of time where you could buy a Wright design and build it yourself, and then you couldn't, and then you could again. So as a licensing guy, how is that all ending up now?
Yeah, so in 2010, the foundation got out of what I call the unbuilt projects business. We get approached all the time. Someone wants to build a Wright building, and we don't allow that to happen. We don't authorize it. And that's for a few different reasons. Number one reason, you can't build those buildings anymore. This isn't the era when you have pages and pages and pages of detailed construction drawings. There might be 2, 3, 5 pages of drawings, and then everything happened in the field under Wright or his apprentices.
So decisions were made on the spot.
Exactly.
Okay.
Second thing is building codes and materials. Mm-hmm. The buildings are going to have to be changed. You couldn't build these buildings anymore, even if we had detailed plans, because the building inspectors wouldn't let you do it. Third, they might not be so suitable for modern living, so someone will immediately start to change them. And once you change it, it's not a Frank Lloyd Wright building anymore. But the other reason, not to put too fine a point on it, is if you're going to go out and spend $1 million or $2 million building one of these buildings, or people want to reconstruct the Larkin building, that's probably a $2 billion project. So you're going to spend a lot of money to construct what would be a fake Lloyd Wright. It's not going to be authentic for all the reasons that we just talked about. Mm-hmm. Well, there's 432 extant buildings, most of which are in need of some help. And we would rather see that investment being made in the authentic works that Wright himself was involved in the creation of, rather than these buildings that will be nothing against Disney, but Disney-esque versions of Frank Lloyd Wright works.
There's also a few other architects out there, you know?
Yeah, well, that's the other thing that we say
Exactly.
in our unbuilt works policy is we recently have had an interaction with the city of Madison, which is we're doing some work on its lakefront. And one of its lakefronts.
This is Monona Terrace?
This is at Monona Terrace. There's a park adjacent to Monona Terrace where there's a group of Wright enthusiasts as they redo this park who want to build a boathouse that Wright designed for not quite that location in 1893. And it's a Queen Anne shingle-covered building. And it in no way reflects Wright's mature style. It's more the juvenilia that he got rid of even at his own home decades earlier.
What is juvenilia?
Early works.
Like
Early works.
the kid pictures you put on the fridge.
Yeah.
Okay,
exactly.
got it.
Before he develops his own style. And, one of the things we said is Madison and the state of Wisconsin, not to mention other places, but let's keep it close to home, there are brilliant architects and designers there. If we like Wright's principles, how about we ask one of those brilliant designers to create something and use Wright's principles, which don't produce buildings that look like his. He produced buildings that look like his. But the principles produce a lot of different buildings, as Wright acknowledged, and he wanted that to be the case. So let's use that project, that very public project, to help create the next architect proud son of Madison, Wisconsin. That would be, we think, a better use of the funds. So this isn't an exercise in hero worship for us. We're not going to say all things Frank Lloyd Wright, are the best. We want to put these principles to work. Wright says, let's perpetuate organic architecture, not perpetuate my buildings, my unbuilt works. So we want to do the work that he asked us to do, create that next generation of architects who are brilliant designers and who design with these ideas in mind.
I would also think that one problem with taking a design of Frank Lloyd Wright's and flying it into some other place is that so much of his designs were a synthesis of the setting, the land, and the house itself. And, if something was right in place X, might suck in place Y.
Mm-hmm. I think that's absolutely critical. I mean, that's a big part of his organic theory of architecture. It's an architecture for its time and place, and you can't just Photoshop it into another context. It doesn't work that way.
Well, you can do that, but it will look awful.
Well, and there are examples where it was done, and honestly, it doesn't work. I'm not going to name any buildings because I don't want the people who are very proud of them. And these buildings were, in fact, authorized by the foundation, as you mentioned, George, back in the day. But there are some buildings that you walk into that are theoretically slavish to Frank Lloyd Wright's designs and his intentions and ideas. But you walk in and they feel sort of soulless. And that's because they're not of their time and place. And therefore, they're not organic. So they don't produce that spiritual quality that Wright was really trying to create in his work by having it integrated with time, place, and the lives of the inhabitants.
I understand that there were a group of people that were trying to out-organic Frank Lloyd Wright, the sort of Bruce Goff school of architecture.
I don't know that I'd say that they was trying to out-organic him, but I think Goff spent time with Wright, spent time with Taliesin, Lautner, Neutra, Schindler. All these people did. And I think what you see is what Wright's intention actually was, which is that, he said, if you really understand what I'm trying to teach you, what I'm trying to give you, your buildings won't look anything like mine. And the architects that we've just talked about, their buildings don't look anything like Frank Lloyd Wright's. But honestly, I don't know. Maybe because Sid may have talked to you, Jen, about Wright's relationship with Goff after Goff separated. But like Lautner's buildings looked nothing like Wright's, but there was this deep respect for Lautner's work, so that when Wright is building in Los Angeles, he actually asked Lautner, who's no longer a part of the fellowship, to supervise the construction because he knows it will be done correctly.
Right.
And that organic synthesis with the landscape will be respected. So I don't know that they're trying to out-organic. I would say that those architects were doing their best, and many of them succeeded very, very effectively in carrying forward Wright's intentions for organic architecture.
I was going to say, I would agree with you a little bit about, it's almost like an overly muscular organic architecture. So if you take Goff, for example, he's clearly interested in materials, and he's getting that from Frank Lloyd Wright and the nature of materials. But then he goes further and experiments with really unconventional materials in his houses. And so they have this kind of he's trying to out-organic or over-muscular. There's something more there. And I think that's growing out of Wright's intentions.
That whole group are super serious about it.
Yeah.
They have no sense of humor about organic architecture at all.
And it's really interesting to talk with some of these guys. And when they get together and talk about their own work,
Right.
there's just such a priesthood around it.
Right.
At your stores that you have, your little gift shops in the different places, what are your best-selling items? What do people buy the most of when they come?
Well, let's sort of separate out between two things. So at the museum stores, there's a lot of souvenir items, but I think what people also really enjoy is seeing the designs, the representations of Wright's work, his visual designs. Often it's graphic design that they can bring home with them. So we sell a lot of T-shirts, we sell a lot of postcards, but we sell some unusual things. Images that are, whether it's a coffee mug or something like that with the stained glass windows. We have Gene Masselink's patterns, one of his apprentices and brilliant graphic designer that's not nearly as well known as he should have been. He died young. But Gene Masselink's work, people love that for note cards and things. Outside of that context of the gift shop, we're right now reintroducing some of Wright's furniture designs. We've reintroduced a partnership with Steelcase, who produced the furniture originally for the S.C. Johnson Wax buildings.
Right.
And that's been reintroduced. We have a rug collection that's about to come out. We have, and this is one of my favorite projects, we have lavatories, plumbing fixtures. And Wright never designed a plumbing fixture, but we spent 4 years with Brizo working with their design team, and they have great designers, that's why we selected them, teaching them Frank Lloyd Wright's principles of design so that they could produce something worthy of bearing the name Frank Lloyd Wright Collection on that work. And we're very transparent that it's
you
not.
can have a Frank Lloyd Wright bathroom?
You can have a Frank Lloyd Wright bathroom. Well, I'll say a Frank Lloyd Wright Collection bathroom because we don't ever want to mislead people into believing that Wright designed it. And we're very clear about that. But it's completely inspired by his principles. And we've actually even got a whole set of videos on the website that explain how we trained people and how we put those principles to work in the designs. So there's all kinds of products that are currently available today that are more than just the souvenir items to bring into your home. And I guess as a final point on this, there are people who sort of deride the souvenir items. Souvenir items provide a lot of income for our work. The licensing program provides a lot of income to preserve these buildings, and not just the two Taliesins. If we are licensing a fixture, a light fixture from Roby House, then Roby House gets a piece of the royalty. We don't keep that all for ourselves. We want to help all these Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. But the thing is, if what you can bring home is a set of coasters or a set of note cards or something like that, if when you interact with them, you remember that you felt really good when you visited Taliesin or when you visited the Martin House in Buffalo, it made you feel at peace. And that's the number one word we hear from our visitors. I feel the sense of peace in this place. Then maybe you're going to think about the impact that great design has on your life. And maybe you're going to be more intentional, more conscious of the role that design plays. And I think when that happens, whether it's Wright's designs or not, when that happens, well, we're helping make the world a little better place, certainly for those people. And maybe they start surrounding themselves with beautiful things, elegant things that bring that sense of peace and happiness into their lives, because that's what great design does. And I think that's our job, is not just to promote Frank Lloyd Wright's work. We think he's an example of great design, but to get people to be conscious of the impact that design has on the world around them and on their lives.
The website is franklloydwright.org, where you can learn all about Mr. Wright and his designs and Taliesin and the history of the organization. And you can even buy what I was hoping Stuart would mention, which is Lego sets of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, one of my favorite souvenirs.
Well, we don't actually have a relationship with Lego anymore. That ended a while back, but we have a licensee called Atom Brick, and they're actually smaller bricks, so they actually reproduce some of the buildings in finer detail than you could with Lego. And
do they hurt less if you step on them on the floor?
I've stepped on them. I don't think so.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well,
that's my metaphor for bad situations. It's worse than stepping on a Lego.
Okay.
Well, Jennifer Stewart, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
That was our conversation on Frank Lloyd Wright with Stuart Graff and Jennifer Gray.
Music has been part of Elaine Lucia's life since her childhood in upstate New York. After playing in Godspell at the Barron's Inn Dinner Theater to studying at SUNY Binghamton and then the Eastman School of Music, Elaine left for the jazz scene of San Francisco in 1982, producing 3 records of jazz standards. An original tune on her 3rd studio album started her on her 4th, an album of all original songs titled Twist Run Road, released in 2020, which highlights her charming, heartwarming, uplifting voice. Welcome, Elaine.
Hi.
Godspell is one of those plays that the actors seem to never forget. I remember that many of the original casts of Saturday Night Live had been in Godspell in Canada before they went on TV. Was it like that for you?
Well, I was very young. I was like 14 years old, and this was a community theater. And I just wanted to sing. So I sang everywhere, whether it was theater or with my music teacher's jazz trio back then, or just playing my guitar and singing. So this was just something that I wanted to do, and I loved it. I loved musical theater and the troupe of actors and singers that I became a part of. Yeah, it was a very formative experience, and the music is just so beautiful. I loved it.
Gospel is now, I believe, about 50 years old since it came out in its original production.
Yeah, that's right.
Elaine, you have been performing for audiences forever, and for instance, you once did a great acoustic guitar rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner for the Maine Inwell High School basketball team. What was that all about?
Oh, my goodness. Wow. How'd you find all this stuff?
We have a great research squad.
That's
Were you
amazing.
inspired by Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock?
No. Oh, my goodness. Wow. So one of my teachers asked if I would sing the national anthem at the basketball games. And I was teaching myself guitar at the time, and I didn't want to stand up and sing the national anthem in the traditional way. I just was inspired to put it to guitar. So I have a really pretty kind of folk-based version of the national anthem. And it's so funny because many years later, I wound up doing it for the Golden State Warriors.
Oh, wow.
When they were playing at the Oakland Coliseum way back then, and Don Nelson was the coach. And I did it, several times in the late 80s, early 90s, walked out there with my guitar in the middle of 18,000 people and sang the national anthem.
It's a notoriously hard song to sing.
Yeah.
That's what I've heard.
And that's another reason why I put it to guitar. I sort of put it into my own style of singing. I'm not a belter. And that song, the traditional way, of course, is belting it out and patriotic and all that kind of stuff.
Fireworks and bombs
like
bursting in light.
And yeah. So, wow, that's amazing that you found that.
From her 2001 album, Elaine Lucia Sings Jazz and Other Things, here's Key Largo, music by Benny Carter, lyrics by Carl Susdorf, and sax solo by Bud Shank.
Key Largo, alone on Key Largo, how empty it seems with only my is lonely, and it always will be till you're with me. I know that I'll stay in Key Largo, watching the shore to find you once the moon's tide rolling in from the sea is lonely, and it always will be till you're with me. I know that I'll stay in Key Largo, watching the shore to find you once more in Key Largo, find you once more in Key
I think you need to reach out to the Key Largo Tourism and Visitors Board
Oh,
because this would be a great song for them.
oh, wow. Well, Sarah Vaughan was the one who inspired me. Her version of that song is what inspired me to record it. And I think her voice is the signature voice for that particular song. It's just so beautiful.
It really is. Now, you are very well known in the San Francisco jazz scene. What's going on out there these days?
I don't know if I'm really very well known in the San Francisco jazz scene these days. I've been recording the past couple of years. Because of COVID, I haven't really been doing a whole lot of live shows. And, the music scene, I think everywhere really suffered because of COVID. And so I really started to focus much more on my writing and recording. So since March of 2020, I've recorded 2 albums. I released one in September of 2020, my current album, Twist Run Road. And then I'm about 75% of the way done with my new album, which is also of all original songs. And that album is called Soul to Soul. So I haven't really been participating in the live jazz scene for the past 2.5 years here in San Francisco Bay Area.
Well, while her new album is not ready yet, from her album in 2020, Twist One Road. From her 2020 album, Twist Run Road, her own music and lyrics. Here's Elaine with Milkweed.
Love is peaceful, love is kind. My love's a secret, my love is fine. I sense my love floating on the air like something rare, like milkweed to surround you. You can choose love, love chooses you. Don't try to fight it, you just can't do it. That's like trying to hide from all the petals in the sky that fall like milkweed to comfort you. You know, loving you reminds me of that day when in that field of milkweed we played. We tear them open and let it fly like snow, falling from a summer sky. Love's a heartbeat, follow along. Love's a singer, loves the song, loves the quiet you hear. When the milkweed disappears, you miss the milkweed. Love's a heartbeat, follow along. Love's a singer, loves the song, loves the quiet you hear. When the milkweed disappears, you miss the
Elaine, the title of that album, Twist Run Road, I understand is in Endicott, New York, right near that high school you played the Star Spangled Banner?
That's correct. That's the name of the street that I grew up on, Twist Run Road.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
How'd it get that name?
Well, it's a very twisty, windy road.
Oh, duh.
that kind of winds its way through, and there's a big hill, and at the bottom of the hill, the road winds its way through these shale cliffs.
Oh.
It's really beautiful. It's beautiful there. Yeah. And it's out in the country, and surrounded by fields and hillsides. And it's gorgeous in the fall with all the leaves. And the song Milkweed was an actual memory of when I was a little girl and all of us kids would kind of play out in the fields, and there was a field of milkweed. And in the late summer, we'd go out there and pick all the milkweed pods and tear them open and blow the milkweed up into the sky all at once, and it looked like snow. So we'd make it snow in the summertime.
And I bet your mom was loving having you come back home covered in milkweed pods.
Well, back then we lived outside. We were gone all day long in the summertime and didn't come home till dinner.
Oh, how times have changed in child raising.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
It's a lovely song.
Thank you.
Elaine's website is Elaine Lucia Music. That's ELAINE music.com. Elaine, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, George. It was such a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Want to go with us to Modernism Week in February 2024? Just email me at george@usmodernist.org. Okay, Tom, wrap us up.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to our past shows, discover documentation of 20,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.1 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Kelly Policelli researched over 40 guests for our Modernism Week interviews. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will be back in 2 weeks with another Sittin' by the Pool edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.